My mom was the one who was always at the rink volunteering. So my mom is blonde. So but people would come in and she often helped with the club, so they would know they were supposed to look for Mrs. Chen. And they'd come in and they'd see my sister and I, the only two Asians in the room, and they'd come up and they'd usually say kind of slowly, "Hi, I'm looking for Mrs. Chen." We would go, "Yeah, mom, over here. Yeah, over there. She's over there." And we just point and they turn and we loved it because it was this encounter. Like it making me laugh every time. And then they'd look around and they would be like looking and they couldn't find her. We'd be yelling, "Mom, they want to talk to you." Right.
Oh my God.
But that's slowing down. And then they couldn't find the person they were looking for. And then they'd all laugh and then they'd be so much more comfortable because turns out Mrs. Chen wasn't Asian and it was going to be a way easier conversation than they were worried about.
And you know what? Since we're on parents, let's just go into it. Just gonna define model minority for everybody. So the model minority myth is a minority demographic whose members are perceived to have a higher degree of socioeconomic success than the population average, thus serving as a reference group to other minorities and racial groups, and then the broader population as well. Often it's used as like a wedge, a tool between racial identities. I know Tina, you can definitely define it way better than I am, but am I kind of on the right track there?
You're definitely on the right track. And I think, it's, I think just really being able to talk about model minorities has been one of the big shifts kind of in the recent years as we begin to think about racism. And I think it's so pertinent to the skating world and helping us to understand, kind of our experiences, particularly as East Asians and the differences across Asian communities. And even as we've been talking, I was reflecting back to my times of skating as well, of these times that we also tend to fall into this idea that things must be getting better, that there's a new narrative. And certainly, the visibility of people like Mirai and Patrick and us knowing who you are as skaters and the way that skating is more global, we see that. But I guess I was thinking back to my story of Tiffany Chen, and I was thinking, when she was on the world podium, she was on the podium with Debbie Thomas, right? So, these are these moments, or, my idols, people like Ty Babylonia, these are like the 80s and 90s aren't that far away. And that kind of idea, how it gets played out. And as Marai's been talking about, I remember it was, with Christy Yamaguchi, how upsetting. And I think this is when I first really realized out loud in my head about the problems of race and skating, when Christy Yamaguchi did not get anything. It was one cereal box on a special issue. I can remember this. And next thing you know, Nancy Kerrigan was everywhere, right? And I was just kind of like, what happened there? Right? Like, all placements. And of course, we all know what happened there. Race happened, right? So thinking through these, and I think this is also where the model minority starts to fall in, but also the model minority only plays a particular role. So, I find this like at a certain moment and often works for the dominant culture. And so there's some great work. One of the historians, Ellen Wu, has, and I'm just going to do the shout out to the book. It's a book called The Color of Success. And it's a great book that really takes us through the stereotype and links it to global politics. So the way that the geopolitics fall in, the way that the Cold War is part of it, the way the civil rights movement folds in, and really traces out why it is that we begin to see more minority groups trying to claim a place, both within Canada and the US, but kind of as models. So to kind of keep their heads down, to gain the rights of citizenship, and that often in these cases, Black communities are doing the same work, but that they're kind of being excluded. So the model minority also is a way that racism and colorism starts to operate, because as they start saying, you get closer and closer to and I think Patrick kind of raised this up, many Asians, we know within Asian culture, and particularly East Asian culture, the ideas of passing, proximity to whiteness, what we should all be horrified at, the idea that someone could become an honorary white was actually seen as something that you might aspire to.
Yeah.
And that, that nations as a whole aspire to. So these are, these ideas that somehow getting closer, but it was about getting closer to power, right? To have some people would just say a seat at the table. And I think this is one of the issues in skating as we also begin to think about it and who we who we recognize. And, and so I also just wanted to kind of throw into this that as we've been talking about Asians, we of course are all talking from the perspective of those who are identified as East Asians. And, even in the Canadian context, some people often get we don't really think and talk about them. So whether it's, obviously Ravi Wali, Emmanuel Sandhu, people who've, been phenomenal skaters in our context and continue to have an impact, that, they, within these contexts, it's also a way of creating kind of divisions around groups. And so asking people to be quiet, work hard, keep going, continue with those kind of stereotypes, but also divide amongst them so that it weakens a political movement. And so in some ways, the model minority was also the response to political mobilization as Asian Americans in conjunction with Black liberation movements, in solidarity with First Nations and Native American movements, right? So it's about a power, it's something used for power. And so that's why we have to be so skeptical of it.
So we define model minority, and it has deleterious effects to not only other racial groups, but to Asian Americans or East Asians in general by saying that you're all successful. But for example, from API data, a demographic data and policy research for AAPI, Cambodians make up only 2% of the Asian population here. Oh, sorry, not here, in America, but 12% of them live in poverty. So Michelle, being from the Cambodian community, can you speak about the Cambodian experience, especially as your parents coming here from Cambodia, surviving a genocide, and how that shaped your childhood, your adulthood, and how did your parents encourage you with skating, insulating you from racism, protecting you, and we kind of talked about tiger parents, but like how do they make you like work harder? Did you think they were militant? Any kind of things like that?
Hmm. Yes, thank you so much for bringing up that statistic, because that's something that gets brushed under the rug. Even within my family, we don't communicate about it because it's that head down mentality. And regardless of what our circumstances are, we're going to make the most of what we have. But it's really important to acknowledge that starting point ultimately. And many people don't know, but Cambodian Americans, they have one of the lowest college graduation rates. So 6.9% of us fall below that of African American students, which is 9.6%. And Hispanics is 7.4%, and Native Americans and have a low graduation rate as well. But it's so interesting because Cambodian Americans never really get communicated about in that context. We're just put under the umbrella of Asian Americans. And so when you think about these stats, in a way, I felt that I needed more. I needed more resources. I needed more mental health support. I didn't know how to ask for it when I was younger. If you think about my parents surviving a genocide, imagine the chemical trauma that my sisters and I have experienced that we didn't get to learn about until we got older. And we're like, why are we reacting the way that we do? Why am I having panic attacks on the ice, running off of the ice and just crying in the hallway and just thinking that I'm a crazy person? I didn't even know what I was experiencing. And there's so many layers to it that if we don't have the knowledge about it, then we can't find a solution. And so I was moving through life as if these historic circumstances didn't affect me, but they do. The next generation is consistently affected. And I'm so happy to be able to have two older sisters to communicate all of this about with. But then I also feel for the rest of the Cambodian American community that might not necessarily have role models like my sister who were able to do things before me, pave the way. And I noticed that what people are doing now is starting to create Cambodian American social media groups and reconnecting with one another. And when I start to hear stories from people within my community and seeing that they've gone through the same exact thing, and they had parents who didn't know how to navigate this world, coming to America and not knowing how to speak the language and trying to figure out what they were going to do in terms of education, because they didn't start out with any knowledge of the American system, the American education system, and they had to start from the ground up. And so ultimately, my parents, what they instilled in me, regardless of the circumstances that we were in, was work ethic. And my parents worked tirelessly with the, my dad would talk about how he was a pizza boy, and it was in San Francisco. He started out in San Francisco, and he got chased by someone with a sword, and like he was put, yeah. And pizza delivery people, I know that the statistics of pizza delivery people are actually high in terms of being assaulted and attacked. But those are the jobs that he had to start out with. If he didn't know how to speak English, then let's, put in the work to make ends meet. And as he went to school and started to figure out, what was next, it was always these odd jobs. But regardless, it put a roof over our head eventually when he had children. And so my parents, they did whatever they could in order to provide us with the opportunity to skate, one of the most expensive sports in the world. But ultimately, the hand-me-down clothes and the hand-me-down skates, I was so lucky and I felt so privileged to have those and people to support me, just similar to how Mirai was talking about. But at the end of the day, my parents made me very knowledgeable of the fact that we don't have the same resources as my competitors. And so we're going to work 10 times harder. We're going to go check out DVDs and VHS, ballet, yoga, Pilates videos. And we made it such a fun experience. And so what we went through wasn't a disadvantage. It was always changed into a positive twist. But there were those underlying things like mental health support and just the suffering that I went through as a Cambodian American child, that I didn't know why I was going through it, but it definitely had to play, my history definitely played a role in that. And so now growing up, I've had to unpack a lot of it and try to understand it all. But if we had the knowledge beforehand, if there's more information being shared about these type of experiences, then I wouldn't have been so confused. But yeah, ultimately, now I feel like it's my duty to also share these things so that the next generation of Cambodian Americans or any other immigrant students, skaters, or whatnot can also feel supported.
Patrick, can you say your experience?
I had suppressed a lot of my pride, my parents' pride, and where they come from and where I come from, which is unfortunate because I hope now it changes. I hope now we're moving in a direction where myself, I've hopefully inspired many other Asian Americans, Asian Canadians to take up the sport and have someone to look up to.
Yeah.
Amazing. Pretty much we're just here to facilitate, and then yes, we relate in so many ways. But it's just, this is a conversation between all of you guys, and as we're just facilitating, because it's all about like listening to your stories and the way that we can identify.
Wait, I have to say, Patrick, that I relate so much to the Tiger Mom thing because my mom was completely that for me. Some days I would be really resentful that she would give me a choice, and she would be like, that watching TV, that you're the one who said you want this, by the way, but all the people you look up to, they're pretty young, so you're the one who chose a sport where you have to work hard while you're young, while all of your friends are having fun, going to birthday parties, but unfortunately, this is what you said you wanted. So we are paying a lot of money. Do you really want to go to that birthday party tonight? Or and also who is going to get you to that birthday party and back? Oh, and are you going to be able to skate in the morning before you go to school? And I'd be like, no, I can't. And then I would be like, you're right. My skating is more important. And although I resented that I didn't get to hang out with my school friends as much, having to make that decision, and although like I was very much persuaded to pick skating over hanging out with my friends, it did instill a work ethic in me that I have taken, not just, like, I mean, a humble brag to say that, like, when I was left off the 2014 Olympic team, it was like, okay, but like, I really want this now. Like, my parents have long since said, okay, you're way past 18 now. Like, can you maybe handle your own career? Like, you make your own decisions and take responsibility. And I think that, starting skating at a really young age and then like growing up to like be like, okay, like I want to move to Colorado Springs so that like I can give myself the best opportunity to make the 2018 Olympic team. And I want my bid for that Olympic team to be one where like US figure skating can't say no. And although, yes, my parents were really hard on me, and I slept in the storage closet of my parents' restaurant because skating was so expensive that we couldn't afford someone to like watch me while like they work like a lot of people did. I am so grateful that, yes, I hated sleeping on a yoga mat in a storage closet, but that community that you were kind of missing, Patrick, like I had that through like hanging out with my parents' customers, and they'd be like, what are you doing? Because there's a lot of times restaurant kids who grew up in restaurants, and I would always be like, I don't know, I'm just doing homework. But having that like interaction with others, and then like a lot of times they would bring me like things to do, and they knew that like skating put a tough toll on my family. And so like the people in my community, I got all the hand-me-down clothes so that like I wore all my friends' clothes, and then like I had that money for skating. And like I think that because my community really supported me from a very young age, even though I wasn't hanging out with them all the time per se, like they were there for me. And so like you may not feel like you were very involved, but I'm sure that like in those newspapers, they were proud of you. They were writing about you because like I literally can't read or write Japanese very well, but my mom will be like, look, this is really cool, isn't it? And I'll be like, yeah, I guess. But I also like my mom was like, you want to skate? Like, do you really want to go to Japanese school? Or she like, we could go skating instead. And I'd be like, yes, skating. And now I like go to Japan, and it's sometimes a little bit hard for me because like I can't read Japanese, but I look very Japanese, even though when I go to Japan, they know that like just the way that I dress, the way that I put my makeup on, I'm very Asian American. And to have that like community to relate to and to find that has meant so much to me, because my first couple, I did one interview in Japanese and they were like, oh, her Japanese is so broken. And I was like, I think I should probably do my interviews in English from now on, because my English is great. And like, if they're going to comment on my Japanese, English, like I am a much more, I enunciate and like put my thoughts together, just because like I grew up in the US and like that is my schooling. And so I think like Michelle said earlier, I would love to read a little bit more about Asian American history, because my parents weren't able to give me that knowledge because they're immigrants. But to only have that little paragraph about Asian American history, I would love to see that more promoted in our history books, just so I know about my culture as well. And I think that if we keep talking about it and asking for it and sharing our knowledge, like that will make a better, like, well, hopefully, be able to live in a society that we can all stand for, because I think that's what we all aim for.
Mirai, you spoke about being Japanese American, having both parents from Japan, born in California, speaking Japanese, but not according to the interviewers in Japan, but and also English. Patrick, Chinese Canadian, you also speak French, Cantonese, and English. Michelle, you are Cambodian American. I actually don't know what
Do you speak? Yeah, what do you
So
speak?
you can say Cambodian, and then in the Cambodian version of our language, it's called Khmer, spelled Khmer.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you speak Khmer with your family as well.
I speak conversational Khmer. So what's interesting, kind of relating back to Mirai and Patrick, I'm getting closer to my roots now.
Yeah.
It's such a reverse engineering type of thing to really look back and sink into the fact that we have been conditioned to erase our identity. And it's so sad to think that, looking back, because of the remarks that kids said to me at school, chink, or pulled their eyes back,
Yeah.
and also just the social cues of understanding how my dad was treated so differently than my mom. Because my mom, she was able to assimilate quickly, and she became a Khmer Cambodian interpreter at the medical hospital. And so she adapted very quickly. Her English was more proficient than my father. And I noticed that even like when we went to Costco or we went to Safeway, the mistreatment and the harshness in the way that people would communicate with my dad because they couldn't understand him. I couldn't say anything at a young age. I just feel uncomfortable, and made me so sad. But then it also made me also do the same thing to my father. So there was a period of time, like it was elementary school, where I was getting those remarks. And then I also, we had an upcoming field trip, and I had to have a chaperone because I'm allergic to peanuts. So during that time, they really wanted a chaperone for liability purposes. And I was like, Mom, please come, please come. But at that time, my dad, I believe he was laid off. So that was a struggle too. And so since he was already home, that was our only option. And I think I like broke down crying because I didn't want my father to come with me, because I was so scared about how everybody else, my peers, would perceive me, us. And it's looking back at that, I wouldn't change it because that was my experience. But I would say to myself now how proud I am to have my dad as my father. He didn't have parents growing up. They passed away when he was really young. And the way he does things is so different. Very, very resourceful. Doesn't want any of us to buy him a new TV. Doesn't want any of us to buy him a new vacuum cleaner. It's all about making sure that we have enough to do the things that we want to do. And so that meant sacrificing the things that like he could enjoy for himself. And so like I relate so much to Mirai's story. And it's so wonderful that you were able to find that positivity out of being able to sleep in the storage closet. And you're like, I get to meet all the customers, and like they were part of my community. And that's so, so beautiful. And I wish that I was able to kind of connect with that sooner. But it's better late than never. And now more than ever, I want to celebrate my father's story. I want to celebrate my mom's story. I want to celebrate my unique history, and really share it with the world so that people understand that Asian Americans aren't this monolith, this narrative that we see on TV. And I think that's starting to happen now because of social media. So yeah, I just wanted to share that in relation to everything that was said.
Yeah. Your dad sounds like an amazing person.
Pause. I am so sorry. I have to go to the meet and greet, but it has been so educational. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge. On that note, I do have to go work. The hustle is real. But I appreciate you guys inviting me and having me, and please email me. Bye guys.
Patrick, I know I would always see your parents at competitions and stuff like that, and they were always so nice to me and would speak with me, and they're just such great people. But how, did your parents encourage you, insulate you, protect you, from the racism, especially because they were immigrants, coming to Canada? So can you talk to that?
They protected me by never talking about it. My mom and my dad, I don't know the experiences they went through. I am absolutely sure they had instances of racism. My dad worked for the Canadian government and immigrated to Montreal at age 3. So he had the luxury of speaking English very fluently without an accent, and spoke French as well, like really was resourceful. I think, like Michelle's story, I think Asian Canadians and Asian American families who have come to this country are very resourceful and do not rely on others. That's that head down mentality, not make a fuss. And so my mom instilled that, my dad and my mom instilled that by not talking about any issues that they ever had. And I'm sure my mom had it because she had a very heavy accent and was around the rink all the time, doing a lot for me, sacrificing a lot, driving me to rink, to school, to this activity. So my parents just, I think it's sad to think that their story isn't talked about more. The just like Michelle's parents' story, this is such a fascinating journey that they went through, and talk about overcoming adversity, making such sacrifices to have a better life. And of course, my parents are going to be hard on me about, like, don't waste time when you're on the ice, no chit chat, because time is money and there's not much of it. So they worked so hard to give me the opportunity to have this lesson or this ice time. So of course, now it all makes sense why my mom was so hard on me. I'm so glad she was, because it taught me other skills, of course. But more importantly, it deep down, that's the psychological effects that coming to a country, escaping the Chinese Cultural Revolution in China and coming to Canada, is you just have this work ethic of just not being extremely resourceful, finding solutions for everything, and not creating a fuss. And so I would love to hear stories, but my mom just, she has so much pride. My parents have so much pride that it's just like, you know what, it's not for you to deal with. Let us deal with it. We'll be the front. And so that you can focus on skating and training without any kind of distraction. So yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, it's very, our parents were definitely like that as well. And just, we just found out, like, recently we have like Cuban roots, and I'm like, what? Like, because my parents came and immigrated from Jamaica, but like didn't really, like, we're learning so much. They didn't really talk about their culture and everything and what they grew up with. And so now we're learning about all these new things, and I'm like, we have Cuban roots? What? Like, okay, speak to that. What? So now we're like starting to find out our like history and stuff like that, and it's just so fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
And it needs to be talked about more. It would be such a shame to not have it somewhere like talked about, and we deserve to know where we're from, and the sacrifices that have been made to get for us to have this life, because our parents didn't have that. They really didn't.
Yeah.
And I think it's so part of that, immigrant mentality, like you said, just like head down, like I'm appreciative of just being in this country, and I'm just gonna work my ass off for everything my kids have. They don't have to know everything. And like I wonder if your parents will tell you now, because my mom and dad are telling me stories, and I'm just like, what?
Yeah.
Huh?
Traumatizing.
How are you not crying on the floor, beating up people all the time?
Yeah.
But yeah, but I think it's important to learn that, because their history and our own personal history is so tied in. You understand the world, like, how Caribbeans were all brought here in Commonwealth countries just to be made and subservient, and like it's kind of like how the same kind of how racism and slavery still kind of continued because the only jobs you could get were subservient roles. Like if you wanted a green card or if you wanted permanent residence, even though you learned English in the British system in Jamaica, you spoke English. They like the only way you can get here is if you're a nurse or a PSW or a maid or a nanny. And so it just continues that cycle. And then you're just when you learn about that, like that was my grandmother's experience. That's why my mom came here and blah 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 blah. It enriches your understanding of your place in society as well as the history of your country. And I want to talk to you, Tina, of course, about yours because, you know, having family from Myanmar, your dad was raised and educated in Calcutta, and then over like them coming to Canada, and then how that introduced your foray into figure skating, and then how you grew up and all that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think my story is like it has a different kind of valence or than Michelle and Patrick, and I think for precisely that reason. My dad, as I said, born in Myanmar, grew up in Calcutta during the wartime years. So they fled Myanmar because of the Japanese occupation. So, and he doesn't really speak about that either. So much like we've all been saying, you know, that trauma is deep and it's something that they've learned to keep to themselves. My dad, then when he was it's a little unknown how old he was, 16 or 17 probably, went to England on his own. And that would be when Burma was going to become an independent country. And his parents kind of made the decision that the instability meant that he would be better to go on his own as a British citizen subject and be able to continue his schooling there. And they then moved back to Myanmar, or what is now Myanmar. And so this really cut off any relationship with the family, given where the politics went, both anti-Chinese in Myanmar, but then the military junta for decades and back again. So, but what it meant for my dad is that he kind of went through what we would think of as his meritocracy. He went to university in England, and then he went to the College of Surgeons in Dublin. And I always find this is a really interesting part of the story because actually that's where all the non-white people from the British colonies went, because you couldn't attend med school in the UK, in England proper. So you went to the College of Surgeons in Dublin. And so all of his friends from med school are from around the world are non-white, and for many of them, they met their partners or spouses there. And then with the immigration policies, particularly in Canada, of trying to bring in professionals in the 60s, that's when my dad came to Canada. In this kind of recruiting a certain group of people. And this feeds into those moments of that model minority and the meritocracy. So you're seeking out certain people, but that meant for my upbringing, my dad is a medical doctor. So he was, and he was also, you know, he was a pediatrician and an endocrinologist. So that meant one of his skills when I was a skater was that he was able to, you know, anticipate growth rates on your growth plates. So what I remember is there were times when he was doing the x-rays of all of us who were the wannabe pair skaters and ice dancers to determine what was going to be the likely height of the girls and their partners. And this was one of his things. So, you know, he had an expertise to offer to the skating community, but mostly he was not there. He was at work all the time. And then my mom was a nurse from Northern England. So they both came over together. But I think for me, my relationship to skating was quite different. You know, how did they enslave me? My dad didn't really talk. He was professional. He was a medical doctor, had respect in those ways. And my mom was the one who was always present at the rink. So, and volunteering. She nursed until my sister was born, I think. And then, so then, you know, took care of the kids mostly. And so I think that's where we had a quite different experience, but I think it really sheds those lights on kind of that meritocracy and not really talking about it and just assuming that things, you know, that there aren't these difficulties. And I'd like to think, you know, I don't think my dad does not talk a lot, although he's very funny when he does, but he doesn't say a lot. But I always say to people, somewhere back in there, he kind of taught me a few things that I'm sure is like the ire that my mom just drives her crazy, like that it's good to be stubborn. And that I didn't have to be quiet. And I don't know if that's, some people tell me they're like, that's because you're the middle child. You got to do like whatever you want. And so, but I like take these to be in some ways, what everyone would say is, because some people also say to me, those are really non-Asian lessons for a girl, right? Like he just told you to like talk loudly all the time. And my mom always goes, yeah, look at you. That's what you do for life. And I was like, that's what I like to do. You're right. I like to talk and tell people my opinions and do all these things. And, you know, she blames it entirely on my dad. So,
God bless him.
Yeah. I like
my mom might also have. Yeah, And so, but I think this is really interesting about the way that kind of minority, because he could fit in, we fit into that kind of mold, and we could kind of operate across in these kinds of realms. But I think, all of this just brings us back to that kind of idea of meritocracy also. And also, I think in the skating group, also, I wasn't as talented as everybody else. So, my parents kind of let me want to do what I was going to do. But my mom, no one needed to be a Tiger Bum. I wasn't actually ever going to make like a national team. In my brain, I thought I was, but I think everyone else was pretty sure that wasn't going to happen. So I was like, they were like, have a good time, do what you can do, but don't worry too much about it, because I think we all knew as soon as I got to grade 12, skating would be done. I'd go to university. That would be the pathway, right? That's what you actually do. And so when you're not as talented as some of the others, there's a benefit to it. But that we get back to this meritocracy, and it takes us away from the structural issues, right? So how all of our parents learn to kind of either they don't want to talk about the struggles, or the rest of society just kind of says, well, you worked for what you earned, and just work for what and you just keep working hard and you will get what you earn. And I think that's true for many. And I think, certainly hearing Michelle and Patrick's and Mirai's stories, we know the parents really work to provide those opportunities. But repeating that story gives that kind of other side, that somehow people who didn't make that success, or who weren't able to, move, who didn't see a socioeconomic, sort of, rise up the ladder, or who still, lived in conditions, that somehow that their work was insufficient. And I think that's where we always have to be, both appreciative, but when we start thinking about these, really reflecting about how that whole idea that it's individual effort and not the systemic issues, right? Then the systemic racism and the way that actually creates it. So Asher, when you talked about, colonialism and slavery, that created a lot of the conditions, right? It's not just about how hard did somebody work, but it's really often about how these structures, create opportunity for some, and allow some people to be strategic amongst them, and others, it kind of keeps them out of that system entirely. And I think, that's still something that skating and society struggle with so much.
Michelle, I like that you found a Cambodian group through, what did you find it through, Facebook or Instagram?
So it's like Two My Sisters is a podcast, and there was another one that's called Asian All American, and basically they reached out to me because they saw my social media platform. And I don't think that previously I opened up and shared about my heritage in the past. I think I kept it all skating. And then it was more so recently in the past few years that I started to really open up about my identity, my struggles, whether it be with body image, eating disorders, my Asian American experience, all of these things that are kept hush hush because of our conditioning within our culture, or our conditioning within our skating environment to always look perfect and be perfect and all this. There's so many layers to why people don't share information. But that was how I was able to connect with these other Khmer folks. And it was so beautiful to have them reach out to me, and we instantly connected just because of our parents. And you kind of already know exactly what they went through, because people who came here, how did they come here? Same exact experience. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch upon when Patrick was saying, you were saying that like, you don't really know your parents' stories, because even when you ask, they might not even share it because they don't want to disclose that information. They don't want you to think about it. But one of the things that I've acknowledged and I've noticed is that it's very traumatizing for my parents. And so even if I do ask about it, there's this lash. Like, why do you want to know? Like, you need to be focusing on this. And it's in a very, aggressive tone. But with that tone is so many layers of unresolved healing. And so that's another part of this head down mentality. It's a suppression. A lot of the people within my community, they're suppressing everything that they went through in order to move forward, survival mode. And when we don't have that opportunity to share a story or release it or be able to share it with our next generation, it's not because I don't think that they don't want to. It's because we don't have the mental health resources to walk us through these things. And I think that's something that is interesting because, yes, in our capitalist society, we see economic status as top of mind. But what if we did a statistic on mental health? Because mental health also equates to success for me, and happiness also equates to success for me. It really depends on who's communicating and what success means to each person. So what if you did a mental health statistic? What would that look like? Where would each different Asian American group fall into that? And so I think it's just a matter of perspective as well, like what society deems as successful. And just unfortunately, it's power, money in our country or in North America, because Canada most likely falls into that as well. But yeah, I think that that's something that would be an interesting thing to consider. And I know that a lot of Asian American mental health resources are also being circulated online. And it's so crazy because it's like, wow, I didn't know that we had this shared trauma. I didn't know that your parents also did that. I didn't know that we feel guilty, but we also are so appreciative, and we feel resentful, but we also want to bow down to our parents. Like, there's so many layers to it. And it's not solely the Asian American experience. I really believe that immigrant families, we go through a lot of the same shared struggle. And that's another thing too, that is something that should unify us. And it would be amazing if we were able to like have a collective and discuss these things. And yeah, I think it's a total perception shift on if we were able to think about things from a perspective that is not in relation to money and power. How would that shift things?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah.
Whoa.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm glad that you're able to find that community that you can speak, to about your history and, kind of maybe piece it together a little bit. That's a blessing of social media. Sometimes it can be problematic, but also can be beautiful. So I'm glad you were able to connect with some people.
Wow.
I was going to add to, like, I had a tough, I think, little time with my parents in terms of like how close we were. I think as an Asian person, the connection, the emotional connection with your parents there's a common theme of like a little bit of disconnection there, and maybe that's because of exactly what Michelle talked about, is that they don't want to talk about some of the struggles that they went through because they rather move on and forget about it, put it in the past and move forward, as opposed to maybe as hard as it is to maybe peel back the layers and talk about it and help them share that burden with me or with others in the community. I think it's, how different could my experience have been with my parents if we had that discussion and really dove into it. How different could that have been? I'm only now reconnecting with my parents and I'm 30. So imagine if I had really connected deeply and emotionally with my parents at 20, 21 years old instead of 30. So because that time you don't get it back. So I think it's so important, to be patient and hopefully reading these stories and talking about them more will make our parents feel more comfortable sharing some of these crazy, really beautiful stories, also sad stories, but all in all, it's so good for them in the long run and for the kids too.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please tune in next week for part 3.
FSDIA's Conversations in Color is recorded and edited in Toronto and Pickering, Ontario, Canada, on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Mississauga of Scugog, Wendat, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississauga of the Credit.
Thank you so much for tuning into FSDIA's Conversations in Color. Please subscribe to our channel. Find us on the gram at Figure Skating DIA on Facebook at the Figure Skating Diversity and Inclusion Alliance, and our website at fsdia.org. And remember to color your